While the revolution raged up and down the Atlantic coast, another struggle was being fought at the heart of the continent, for the future of the continent, the western frontier. For years, American settlers had been pushing their way into Britain's vast lands beyond the Allegheny Mountains. In response, the British began inciting their Indian allies to attack them.
On the whole, the Native Americans, the Indian tribes, supported the British in the American Revolution because they believed that they stood a better chance of retaining their lands than if the notoriously land-hungry colonists controlled the frontier areas.
In 1778, a plan to cut off the raids was proposed by a tough, red-haired explorer from Virginia, Militia Colonel George Rogers Clark. He would attack the undermanned British forts in the Northwest, present-day Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois. If he succeeded, he would also extend Virginia's boundaries to cover an area nearly the size of Europe. On the 26th of June, Clark and 175 frontiersmen shot the rapids of the Ohio River into enemy territory. The mission was made more ominous by a total eclipse of the sun. Clark assured the men it was a good omen. Pushing them around the clock, Clark got his men to the mouth of the Tennessee River in 4 days, then led them overland to hack their way through 50 miles of forest.
George Rogers Clark, is he a great tactician? Not terribly. Is he a great planner? Not really. But he can get men to walk through swamps. He can get men to do incredible feats that they don't believe they can do themselves.
On July 4th, only 8 days after they set out, Clark and his men arrived near the British-held town of Kaskaskia in the Illinois country. Within 15 minutes, they surrounded the town's fort and took it without firing a shot. The French settlers were relieved to learn that France and America were now allies and that Clark hadn't come to kill them. 180 miles away, French settlers in the Indiana country happily greeted news of the alliance by turning over the prized fort at Vincennes to Clark's state of Virginia. To hold Vincennes, Clark sent 3 soldiers, all he could spare. Six months later, the fort was retaken by British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton, called the hair buyer for his willingness to purchase rebel scalps. When Clark heard of the loss of Vincennes, he lamented, "I would have bound myself for 7 years a slave to have 500 troops." What he did have were 150 troops and few supplies. In the chill of February 1779, Clark began the long, hazardous trek to take back Vincennes. In places, the country was flooded 5 miles across with chest-deep, icy water. Rarely did the men wear dry clothes or sleep on dry ground. Not one deserted. "17 days after setting out, Clark's small band arrived a mile from the fort. To give the illusion of several columns, Clark divided his men and, as in the biblical Battle of Jericho, told them to make as much noise as they could. Colonel Hamilton assumed some drunken locals were firing off their guns until one of his men fell from a rifle shot. The next morning, Clark demanded that Hamilton surrender immediately and unconditionally. Hamilton refused. That afternoon, Clark forced Hamilton's hand. His men had just captured an Indian raiding party, including the young Ottawa chief Makut Mong. Clark ordered the Indians tomahawked in full view of the fort. Clark was still wiping blood from his hands when he met Hamilton. The next morning, the British commander surrendered the fort. When his campaign was over, Clark had claimed for Virginia a territory more than half the size of the 13 colonies. But the land would seesaw between the British and rebels for the rest of the war. While the British were defending the Northwest, back east they were launching the most notorious Indian raids of the war. In November, about 50 miles west of Albany, a party of Mohawk warriors and Tory Rangers descended upon Cherry Valley, New York. The town was plundered and torched. 32 men, women, and children were slaughtered, many both scalped and dismembered. For both Congress and General Washington, the massacres were the last straw. In February of 1779, Washington ordered the total destruction and devastation of the Indian settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. The Indian country was not merely to be overrun, he said, but destroyed. The commander-in-chief committed nearly 5,000 troops to the mission. The American Army leveled more than 40 Indian towns and their fields and their orchards. 80% of the Seneca's tribal land was ravaged. Devastated, the Six Nations of the Iroquois were forced to beg food from the British that bitterly cold winter. Hundreds died of starvation and disease. Others froze to death.